Hello, my wonderful viewers, and welcome to another episode of Betty Adams Overanalyzes. Today we are going to look at a particular scene in Chapter 11 of The Mandalorian that some reviewers, and by some I mean a particular one, seem to have taken a bit amiss. Now don't get me wrong, I understand perfectly where they are coming from. This is the scene where the Mandalorian is trapped in the monster feeding hold while Baby Yoda is trapped down further in the manticore itself. Bo-Katan and company show up and rescue him, and he pleads with them to rescue the child. The other female Mandalorian instantly jumps in and hauls out Baby Yoda. Now, I enjoyed this scene, and honestly, it was so perfectly part of the story as a whole that I didn't really think about it as a scene. As a creator, there was nothing unexpected in the scene. It just fits seamlessly in with the themes and flow of the show up to this point, and so seamlessly that it never occurred to me to question it, or even mention it in my full spoiler review, until a few days later when I had finished my spoiler review of the episode and was indulging myself in listening to the opinions and analysis of my fellow overanalyzers. Now, most of the reviewers like me had barely mentioned this scene. However, one in particular found it was irritating. While I fully disagree, I also fully understand, and their analysis really got me thinking hard about this scene, hard enough to justify a whole nother video analysis just on this scene. In short, this other analyzer thought that the creators were Damseling our belovedly awesome Din Djarin. Except they used the term Mandalorian, which pleased my inner dad joke-loving brain to no end, so I'm going to keep that up, Mandalorian, until I find a scene where I actually can use it. Now, for those who might not know, Damseling is the trope where a character is put in danger, usually through being taken captive, for the plot purpose of forcing the rest of the cast into motion, usually uniting otherwise unconnected characters and often forcing them to put aside their differences. It comes from very old stories, often where a knight in shining armor has to go and rescue a damsel in distress. Traditionally, the damsel in question has been a young woman, but can technically refer to any character who's been put in this situation. It is a common trope used to drive the plot forward, and it's used heavily in fiction and fantasy. Unfortunately, due to Sturgeon's law, wherein 90% of everything is made of poor quality, that means that this trope has acquired the stink of bad writing and poor quality storytelling using cheap gimmicks to drive the story, unfortunately, as many tropes do. Now, technically, yes. And this is one of those things where tropes get a bad name. Tropes are not inherently bad, remember that. They're just tools you use. And whether or not the trope is good or bad depends on how you use it in the story. And technically, yes, this scene does appear to fit the damseling trope. On the surface, a main character who's usually fairly competent is trapped and helpless, and the confinement does in fact lead to action on the part of the rest of the cast. And yet, I did not see it that way at all, and I'm usually pretty quick to pick up on poorly used tropes. Now, I will go into detail later on why I think that this was not a true damseling, but what was instead a conjunction of other tropes and physical realities that simply gave the illusion of the damseling trope. It's like that trick you're shown in 3rd grade, where you're shown three black cutouts on a white piece of paper, and you can see a triangle clearly, but it's actually 3 hoof-shaped cutouts, and you're just imagining the triangle because our brains are pattern recognition machines. So I think that's what's happening here. Our brains are recognizing a pattern and seeing something that's not really there. However, let's glance back at Sturgeon's law in full. It goes like this. Yes, 90% of science fiction is trash, but 90% of everything is trash. But it's that remaining 10% that's worth fighting for. Yes, you may know another version of Sturgeon's Law, but this is the one that I grew up with. So here's my point. I personally do not see this scene as damseling, but I freely admit to the viewpoint that it is understandable. Basically, someone could easily see this as damseling. The triangle's not really there, but there's something there that makes our brain think a triangle is there. So I will make 2 arguments, with the shorter one first. If this scene was damseling, it was damseling done right. It was logically consistent with the rest of the show, needed to advance the character development of Din Djarin, which I argue is the main plot of the show, not all this side nonsense about empires rising and falling. And it was important to advance the character interaction of him and Bo-Katan, and therefore did not jar against the tone of the show in any way. In short, if this was damseling, which I don't think it was the 10% of damseling that is worth fighting for. However, like I said, from my perspective as a writer and a long-term science fiction and Western fan, this was not a damseling. Rather, it was a conjunction of a series of Western and science fiction tropes happening to overlap with several medical and scientific realities that gave the appearance of damseling, a false damseling, if you will. As I said, it did not occur to me in the slightest that this might have been a damseling until I heard somebody else suggest it. So, what was this scene if not a damseling? First, let's look at Din Djarin's character development over the course of the season and a half we have so far. He is a loner who's been gradually learning to work with others. This is a classic Western trope that folded into science fiction so naturally through the mediation of pulp magazines that it is considered a native science fiction trope as well. Born with the genre and older than the genre, the Lone Ranger grudgingly working with the army unit, the old hobo stopping a season to help the widow woman work her farm till her husband returns. Now, there are two main variants of this trope. In the simplest one, it just has the hero learn to play well with others, period. The second form has a hero who does not know how to play well with others, but only if they are part of his inner circle. The crusader, the monk. In this case, the character development comes when he has to learn to play well with others outside of his organization. The by-the-book police officer who learns to wing it with the civilians, the military officer who learns to work with the opposing faction, etc., and so on. What was the big one? The big shining science fiction example of this, Enemy Mine. Yes, Enemy Mine. Now, the second variant has a second variant that is not uncommon, but is usually reserved for the better written and longer forms of fiction and fantasy. It involves essentially two rebirths, two beats. In this one, a member of an organization first learns to work with the organization, usually a fallen hero who reclaims the code that they fell from. Then, the second beat, the second rebirth, comes when the hero realizes that the code that he's learned to follow better isn't enough, that they need to go beyond or behind the code and discover the underlying truth that the code is built on. This requires a second, more intense breaking and dying sequence, and I believe that this second dying to be reborn motif is what we're seeing here in this scene. Now, Din, at this point in the series, has already completed the first step of his story arc. His first death and rebirth, the one that led him back to his true code and allow him to work well with others, happened in episode 9, when he symbolically episode chapter 8? Anyway, the one where he's back on Navarro and rescues baby Yoda from Moff Gideon. In this one, he symbolically crossed the river Styx and came out of the lava tube. The death and rebirth symbolism was heavy. That giant droid on the barge that carried them through the lava tube, that was Charon, the ferryman of the river Styx. Very, very obvious visual cues to what's going on there. In this case, Din Djarin has learned to work with others. However, in the person of Bo-Katan and her night owls, he faces the second and much more difficult challenge, working not just with heathens, but with heretics, people who claim to be Mandalorians, but who do not follow his version of the code. This will be a much more painful metaphorical death and rebirth, because the first one was Din learning to follow more truly the code he had devoted himself to. The second, doing what he knew was right, what he was told was right, what everything agreed was right. This second one will be Din facing the fact that it's not just himself that is failing to meet the expectations of the code, but that the code itself is wrong or at the very least incomplete. If you want to know how hard this can be for people, just do a quick search for any record of conflicts between Protestants and Catholics, and you will quickly be enlightened. The point being that as hard as the show worked to break our Mando in season 1, it is going to have to work twice as hard to break him in season 2, or at least before the series resolves. Because ultimately, this show is the hero's rebirth cycle. The hero must be battered and broken. He must at some point be so utterly helpless that he cannot save himself. And that breaking process is what we are seeing here, that ascension towards death. This situation didn't come out of nowhere either within the context of the show. It was perfectly logical given the events of season 1 and season 2 up to this point, that Din would be essentially helpless in that situation in the Manticore hold on the fishing trawler. It would have been more unrealistic if he had been able to get himself out of that trap. So let's take a look at how messed up Din Djarin was at that point. First of all, this takes place in a very short time. We don't know what kind line of time because Star Wars is famous for warping the sense of time. I refer you back to the famous example, how long did Luke train on Dagobah with Yoda Sr.? So, but looking at what we see, Season 1 and Season 2 do appear to take place in a short time. It can't have been more than a month or two between the first episode of Season 1 and the third episode of Season 2. Maybe longer, but it doesn't really apply to my argument here. In that time, Din has received multiple injuries and has received no real medical attention that we know of. Season 1, he gets dropped off the top of a sand crawler and then rammed about repeatedly by a mudhorn. It is heavily implied that the mudhorn deactivated the inertial dampeners that are implied to be in the Mandalorian armor, so all damage he took between the mudhorn and when he gets his new armor isn't going to be mitigated by that. Din canonically gets a near fatal concussion and severe internal injuries in the final battle of Season 1, for which he only receives basic first aid, a Bacta spray. Now, we don't know the time lapse between Season 1 and Season 2, but it wasn't too long. Now, for Season 2, Din has the full inertial dampeners in his suit, but things still get pretty wonky for him. He gets eaten by a crate dragon, he crashes his speeder, and thus has to hike back to Mos Eisley. Then, and most importantly, he receives further injuries when the ship crashes on the ice planet in the second episode. He was unconscious for a while, meaning he had at least one more concussion on top of the concussion that he already had. And remember, concussions never heal. And then he has broken ribs, as shown by his behavior when fixing the Razor Crest. Injuries he fought off the spiders with and then continued fixing the Razor Crest with. Now, add to that how hungry Din had to be in the scene when he was knocked down the hole to the Manticore. It was in Season 1 episode... We saw in Season 1 episode 4 that he really has to take off his helmet to eat. That means that for the entire trip from the ice planet to the moon of Trask, he didn't eat because he was trapped in the cockpit of the Razor Crest with Mrs. Frog. And we all know about Mandalorians and their helmets now, don't we? Then the show makes a point that he doesn't eat at the inn where he gets information. The show made a very big point about that. Now, that was stupid of Din, but the man has at least 2 active concussions at this point, several broken ribs, multiple internal organ injuries, and he is running on fumes. It is a miracle the man can walk. And now his blood sugar has crashed slower than the fuel reserves of the Razor Crest. Again, all of this is part of the breaking of the hero for the second rebirth process. It is necessary to the kind of story this is. So, that is the state he is in when the Karen fisherman knocks him into the Manticore hold. Din instantly dives in after Baby Yoda, but there is almost nothing he can do at that point. His armor drags him down, and importantly, his armor isn't air or watertight, as was specifically revealed in the last episode when he tells Mrs. Frog that they will all die if the cabin loses pressure. Now, some Mandalorian armor is airtight, but that requires the pressure-tight undersuit, which the armor wouldn't have been able to forge for Din, because, she's a blacksmith, not a seamstress. So, Din was concussed in excruciating pain and literally starving when the other Mandalorians show up to rescue him. His first thought is of the child, and he's not really conversing with them, he's kind of chanting. This is a thought that's in his brain that's just barely getting out of his mouth. He's so exhausted and weak. And instantly, Bo-Katan sent one of her night owls down after Baby Yoda. And again, there the actions of the characters are perfectly logical. She sends down the smallest of the 3 Mandalorians she has access to. Some people pointed out this as an oddity. She should have sent the biggest one down to fight the beast. But this is just a real-world practical application. Bo-Katan has 3 choices to send down after the child. Herself, a man even bigger than Din, and a woman smaller than herself. Now, physical strength isn't going to be much of a factor against a Manticore. You can't actually punch a shark. It is bigger and stronger than all of them, and whoever goes down will need to use force multipliers, such as projectile weapons and explosives, to kill it or rip it open and get Baby Yoda out. The defining limitations of the mission are lack of oxygen and lack of space. Now, let's take a flashback to reality. Many years ago, when I was a tiny bit of a thing, the local schools really liked to bring in firefighters to give safety lessons and presentations about firefighting. We learned to stop, drop, and roll, and I was highly convinced that catching on fire was something that happened a lot to little kids. But they brought in the firefighters. They would bring their full gear and show us how all the air tanks and tubes worked. And it just so happens that a firefighter's gear is probably the closest approximation we have to Mandalorian gear. And we naturally asked how long the air tanks lasted, because that was probably the coolest part of their equipment. And they told us that depended entirely on who was wearing the air tank. A large man would burn through the tank in a few minutes, and a small man would last longer. But a small woman would last even longer than that because she used so much less oxygen. The firefighter told us that when they had to do search and rescue in heavy smoke where physical strength wasn't really needed but oxygen and time were, it was policy to send basically the smallest woman because she would nearly have 3 times the amount of time as the largest man would. In another real-life situations, a few decades ago, a Soviet nuclear submarine was snooping around the east coast of the United States and had a reactor start to melt down after a game of chicken with an American nuclear sub went terribly wrong. This is all well documented. The chief engineer on the sub couldn't shut down the reactor on his own. It took 2 people. He had to be in there because he was the only one who knew how this rusty old nuclear reactor worked. And whether or not he had help, it was a suicide mission for both of them anyway. So the chief engineer said he needed the smallest, youngest member of the crew to come help him because younger people use less oxygen. But that is a whole other story about how the United States and the world owes an unradiated East Coast to the sacrifice of a Russian farm boy. If you're interested in that story, go check out the book Hostile Waters by Peter Hutchison. I'll put the link in this link below. Hostile Waters by Peter Hutchison. But anyway, the point that's relevant to this scene in The Mandalorian is that Bo-Katan sends the smallest, youngest female in the situation into the situation where there would have been limited space and limited oxygen. Given the situation, given how damaged Din was, given the real science of physical limitations, and most importantly, given the type of story that is being told, that scene could not have gone any differently. And Din's behavior both immediately after Baby Yoda is rescued and something that bothered me about episode 1 supports the concussion theory. Once Baby Yoda is placed in his arm, he starts asking Bo-Katan and company for their help. But his words are stilted. It's clear that he is reciting something by rote, that he is not thinking clearly, probably not thinking at all, just acting on memory and impulse. If you remember back to my first review of this second season, I mentioned that the same rote-sounding explanation in Din when he was talking to some other characters on Tatooine. At the time, it just seemed odd, like bad acting on the actor's part, but looking back at it in the light of all the injuries Din has been building up, I think that stilted conversation was just the first cracks beginning to show on Din's psyche from all the physical and mental stress he's under. So, that is my conclusion. This scene wasn't Din Djarin being used as a damsel, or manzel in distress. It was the classic hero being broken bit by bit for his second rebirth scene. But again, taken in the moment, those scenes would be almost identical, and the only difference is found in the context of the situation. So I see where the people calling it manzeling are coming from. Manzeling. Now, one last thing. There's another scene where Mando gets supposedly rescued by Bo-Katan later in the episode, and I might be tempted to write it off with the exact same explanation, not damseling, but breaking the hero, except I don't think that's exactly what it was. In this scene, a Koran claiming to be the brother of the Koran fisherman who tried to off Mando shows up supposedly to get revenge. However, the timing is odd. Even if the supposed brother knew about the trap beforehand and was willing to do something as stupid as take on a Mandalorian in a straight-up fight, and not even ambush him, but step out into the light and clearly warn said Mandalorian ahead of time when the Mandalorian was armed, well, I am pretty sure that the writers were hiding one trope behind another here. This is a Western trope after all. We would expect a brother to show up for revenge and not question it. But 1, how did the supposed brother even know that the other brother was dead without knowing that it was Bo-Katan who had killed him? 2, how did he gather up a gang so fast? 3, why would he be stupid enough to step out into the light and warn Mando first before even beginning to attack him? Now, we know that Bo-Katan is perfectly willing to lie to Mando and perfectly willing to ruthlessly murder whoever gets in her way. That's just her character. She was part of Death Watch after all. There is a huge possibility here that Bo-Katan deliberately hired the thugs to make a show of ambushing Din Djarin dramatically so she could have another chance to swoop in and offer her help. Now, you and I both know that Mando could have fought his way out of that situation. Close quarters combat is his specialty, and even if the ambush was legit, he didn't strictly need Bo-Katan's help. It was nice that he didn't have to beat them down himself, but not necessary. And interestingly, she continues the theme by offering him a drink, something which he did not need, but which would have been nice. Now, there is a quirk of human psychology where if someone does for us something that we are incapable of doing, if we really do owe them a deep debt according to our own code, then that inspires more resentment than gratitude. Many creators over the years have taken advantage of this by, instead of having characters save another character elf's life, they arrange a chance for the other character to seemingly save their character's life. A human feels much more charity towards someone they have helped than towards someone who has helped them. However, if someone helps you by opening a door when your hands are full, you get the gratitude without the sense of debt and therefore the sense of resentment. But after all, this was just someone being a decent person. For Mandalorians, beating down someone who ambushed another Mandalorian is pretty much the equivalent of opening a door. Not necessary, but just the polite thing to do. Setting up an ambush and then rescuing Din from it would have allowed Bo-Katan to reset the emotional tenor of their relationship. Din would be less resentful for having been seen helpless and needing rescue by some heretics, and would now be feeling mild gratitude for what was unnecessary but polite attention that saved him some trouble. So, what do you think, my wonderful viewers? Was Din Djarin mansled in this episode, or was it just a natural consequence of the hero being broken? Leave a like below if you agree, and leave a comment telling me how wrong I am if you disagree. By the way, I am not just being polite and not calling out who made these comments. I watched about a dozen analysis videos in a row, and I honestly just can't remember who made these comments. So, let me know if you guys do. Peace out, my wonderful viewers, and see you next time.